Was the PS4 better than the PS5? Is Sony making less games for the PlayStation 5? Is Sony doing a bad job justifying the PS5 upgrade? Huge shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. How's it going, everyone? Welcome to PSReady. I was on Twitter a little while ago and I saw this tweet going around from Zubitech that's basically a direct comparison of the amount of games that we had gotten up until this point on the PlayStation 4 directly compared with the PlayStation 5. On the surface, it does look like there's way less stuff coming out for the PlayStation 5 than the PlayStation 4 at the same time, but if you look a little closer, there are some pretty easy explanations, and honestly, it makes me think that the PS5 is actually doing a little bit better than I thought. So the first big explanation, which we hear a lot as to why there are less big AAA games coming out these days, is because A, games take longer to make, and B, people have been conditioned to expect a lot more from games now in 2023 than they did back in 2014. Like, they were still figuring out the whole way to make big open world experiences, and now we're getting games that have insane motion capture that looks like real life. We're getting games that have massive open worlds and 50-hour stories and gameplay mechanics that have to build on the games that came before, and people are even starting to say now that everything is kind of blending together. So there's an increased pressure on developers to make their games as unique as possible, and obviously all of that makes things take a lot longer. Additionally, this huge thing happened in 2020 that kind of disrupted the way games are made, and that's kind of why we've seen such a huge gap, whereas now in 2023 the output is absolutely insane. Like 2023, because of how long it takes to make games and how the whole development process of a lot of these games was disrupted, is definitely going to go down as one of the best years in history for games. Like, honestly, this year alone is on par, I would say, with something like 2007, where we got stuff like BioShock and a billion other amazing games in the same year. I mean, this year alone, we've gotten Dead Space, we've gotten Jedi Survivor, we've gotten Resident Evil 4 Remake, Street Fighter 6 is coming out very soon, and it's getting 10 out of 10s across the board. Diablo is being called the best Diablo game ever and is getting really good reviews as well. And there is stuff coming out later in the year like Spider-Man 2 and Final Fantasy 16 that we're looking forward to. We might even hear about some new huge games during Summer Game Fest and the Xbox Showcase that'll be third party and come out on both consoles that may come out this year as well. So yeah, 2023 is kind of picking up the slack that was definitely felt in 2020, like fall 2020 when the PS5 came out, 2021 and 2022. Like, comparing the list of games that have already come out in 2023 from the first party, it's pretty comparable to what we saw in 2022, which is awesome. Another really interesting thing I noticed as someone who's been playing PlayStation games since the PS3, like pretty religiously. I started that generation with an Xbox 360 and then I saved up a bunch of money, and by the time I got a PS3 there were already a ton of games out. I got it the year Uncharted 2 came out. So the games I got when I bought the thing were Infamous 1, Little Big Planet 1, Uncharted 1, and then I got Resistance 2, and I got Uncharted 2 for Christmas that year as well. So I got a ton of great games, and I've been playing PlayStation games ever since. So I can tell you that one of the reasons it looks like there are a lot more games coming out back on the PS4 is because of a practice Sony still does. This is the first reason. There are many reasons. The first one is that Sony used to release a big AAA game, and then a couple months to a year later, they would release a whole new game for a cheaper price that was a standalone experience for sure, but it was built in the original game's map. The example I see in 2014 is Infamous Second Son. Very soon after that came out, we got Infamous First Light, which was a standalone experience featuring, I think her name was Fetch. That game was awesome. I think I liked the story in First Light more than I liked it in Infamous Second Son, but that's besides the point. We also saw them do this in 2016 and 2017 with Uncharted 4 and then The Lost Legacy. That was a Naughty Dog move where The Lost Legacy was actually just supposed to be DLC, and then it ballooned up into its own game. And then finally, with the PS5's launch, we saw this again with Spider-Man Remastered and Spider-Man Miles Morales, or Spider-Man 2018 Miles Morales. Like, Miles Morales was the smaller game built in the same map as the first game, but it was a standalone experience. And then the final thing I noticed is that Sony really put themselves in a weird spot by closing down a lot of studios. If you look at the list of early PS4 exclusives, stuff like Drive Club and The Order 1886, Sony shut down Evolution Studios after Drive Club, and Ready at Dawn, I'm pretty sure, was purchased by Oculus to make VR games exclusively, mainly because the Order 1886 didn't really light the sales world on fire. Another studio Sony disbanded was Japan Studio, and they were actually responsible for a lot of these games early on in the PS4 lifecycle. They're not really a developer so much as they were like an overseer who would kind of provide support to third-party studios. I'm talking about stuff like The Last Guardian, Gravity Rush, and Everybody's Golf. So Sony shut down a lot of these studios, or they went to other publishers or other companies. They were picked up. There's been a mass consolidation, and Sony has, to their credit, done a good job keeping up with Xbox and other big corporations that are buying up these studios. The issue is they're kind of having the same problem Xbox had, where like you're buying these studios and then you're letting them start up new games, and those games take long to produce. And it's kind of all created this perfect storm where these studios that Sony's buying are working on new games, and the studios that they've had for a long time are also working on new games. Naughty Dog is working on allegedly The Last of Us Part 3. That multiplayer game doesn't look like it's going to materialize, which really sucks, but what can you do? Ghost of Tsushima 2 is assuredly being worked on over at Sucker Punch. Insomniac has been great about releasing games at a pretty fast clip, but if you look at the games they're releasing, it makes sense as to why. Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart is like a direct sequel to what they already made back in 2016. It's just a little bit bigger. Spider-Man 2 looks like an expanded version of what we saw in Spider-Man and Miles Morales. They're just being smarter about their releases, whereas the other studios are building huge experiences like the one I just mentioned, Ghost of Tsushima 2. They got to make a whole new game basically from the ground up, and that takes a long time. So yeah, when it comes to games, if you take the first few years of the PlayStation 4 and compare it to the first few years of the PlayStation 5, on the surface, it kind of looks like there were more games coming out back then, especially if you do raw number to raw number, there definitely were, but I'd argue that the quality of games has massively increased in what Sony has produced, A, and B, they've done a really good job keeping that same strategy going, where they release games and then they release a standalone experience in the same map, or they make sure that studios can work on multiple games at the same time, or they buy new studios and get them working on games, or they get indie games like Humanity, the one they just released on PS Plus. I think they're not doing a bad job at all releasing games. It's just games are more expensive to make, games take longer to make, and everyone's expecting a standard to be met now, especially with frame rate, which makes things even harder. So yeah, it looks like it's pretty crazy on paper when you directly compare the game output of both consoles, but I'd say the PS5 is doing a pretty dang good job, especially with the releases that we've seen in 2023. And I'm counting third party there because most of these games play better on the PlayStation 5. Even the middling games like the Callisto Protocol really did feel like a PlayStation 5 exclusive, thanks to those DualSense features that the game came along with. And as far as the hardware goes, it's a night and day experience. I will tell you that back in the day when the PlayStation 4 came out, there was a pretty long period in which there were PS3 games still coming out, and we didn't have this great backwards compatibility that made games run better like they do from the PS4 to the PS5. So I had my PS3 plugged in for at least a year or two after the PS4 came out, because there was a huge drought of games, not just first party games, but third party games as well on the PlayStation 4. So I really had no choice. Games like the Metal Gear Solid HD collection, I played through that on my PS3 after the PS4 came out. I also got Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, which was not on PS4, and I still don't think is playable on the PS4 or PS5. But thankfully, with the Master Collection, they're doing volumes, and hopefully they eventually get to Revengeance because it's one of the best games ever. I absolutely love it. But another area where I think the PS5 is winning as well is just hardware quality. The PS4, when it came out, really felt underpowered, and the reason for that is that the generation where we had the 360 and the PS3 was extended. There was a recession in the middle of that generation, which that's kind of scary right now, obviously, but that caused people to not really want to spend money on video games or new consoles. So Sony and Microsoft, and I guess to some extent Nintendo, looked at the situation and said, well, can we push just a couple more years out of these consoles and then release this PS4 and Xbox One that we've been working on for a couple of years now and actually have ready to go just a few years down the line? And that's exactly what they did. So when the PS4 and Xbox One came out, both of those machines were underpowered, and they definitely kind of felt underpowered, exemplified by the fact that I was able to just keep gaming on my PS3 for quite a long time after I got the PlayStation 4, and I genuinely didn't care. I mean, one of the best launch titles for sure for the PS4 was Killzone Shadowfall, and it did a lot of visual trickery to make it feel next gen, but I think that game probably could have ran on a PlayStation 3 just because Killzone 2 came out so many years prior to that, and looked amazing for the time. And it was not that far off gameplay wise from what we saw in Shadowfall on the PS4. Additionally, the PS4 really slowed down a lot after its first couple years on the market. I think people kind of expected that, but they didn't expect it to slow down as much as it did. You could attribute that to the hardware being a little bit outdated by the time it came out. You could also attribute that to it using a HDD instead of an SSD. And finally, you could attribute that to its terrible network connectivity that everyone hated at the time, because the PlayStation Store that we had that generation was not great. I mean, I remember when they introduced that new keyboard where you had to go down like a sliding scale for every letter and go all the way across. And it was like, I will do everything in my power to show you everything except the game. You'd get DLC, you get avatars, you get themes, you get everything except the game you were looking for. So you had to type out the entire name. And yeah, because of all of that stuff combining, the PS4 felt sluggish and it felt unoptimized and it felt kind of unfinished for a little bit. Whereas the PS5, that operating system is awesome. It was awesome at launch and it's only gotten better. My PS5 is just as fast now as it was when I got it. I never have to wait for the store to load because it's actually built into the console's operating system. I never have to wait very long for games to download because Sony finally figured out how to make downloads go faster on the PSN, and unlike in the PS4 generation, I can actually change my PlayStation Network name. And sticking with the hardware real quick, I think one area though where the PS4 definitely beats the PS5 is with how it looks, specifically the launch edition of that console. I always thought that trapezoid shape that they launched with was really cool. I like the two-tone look, even though the black plastic scratched up super easily on the original PS4. And yeah, the design of it I think was overall a little bit nicer to look at, but PS5 stays a lot cooler and just overall feels like it works a lot more efficiently than the PlayStation 4. And unlike that console, this thing does not break a sweat running games at 1080p, and most of them will run at 60 FPS if you're playing at that lower resolution. So from a hardware standpoint, I really have no complaints with the PlayStation 5 other than it's a little too big for my TV cabinet, but that's not a huge complaint at all. It's just something I noticed. So if you compare the hardware, I'd say, while yes, the launch models, the PS4 looked a little bit better. If you look at the PS4 Pro and compare it to the launch PS5, I think the PS5 looks better. And if you take the PS4 Slim and compare it to the PS5 that we have now, I think the PS5 looks better than that. And overall, the PS5 just runs better across the board. So I love this console. And then finally, Sony's always been pretty good with accessories, but one thing that they've definitely gotten better at with the loss of the PS Vita and all this other stuff that they were concentrating on is making the PS5 the center of their ecosystem, right? Like you had the Vita and you had the PS3, you had the Vita and you had the PS4, and they kind of worked together, like they could talk to each other, and you could buy some PS3 games and you'd get a free Vita code with it. But at the end of the day, they felt like totally separate experiences. Whereas now you have the PlayStation 5 at the center of it all, and then you branch out from there. So you get your PS5. If you want VR, you buy the PSVR 2. You need a PS5. It's a single cable solution because most of the stuff is running off of your super powerful console. That's awesome. You want to get a handheld now in the PlayStation ecosystem. You're going to be able to do that. It's just going to be able to play games directly from your PlayStation 5. So Sony basically created the Wii U, which, you know, I'm not super into the idea of streaming games from my PlayStation 5, but that's really because I have so many other ways to do it. If I was younger, I was a kid in middle school, a kid in high school, I had to beg my parents to buy me a PlayStation 5, it would be much harder to convince them to get me a whole extra handheld than it would be to convince them to get me a supplementary handheld that works with the PlayStation they already bought me, and most importantly is much cheaper, right? We don't know what the Project Q is going to cost, to be fair, but I think Sony understands that they have to keep the price low, or they would have made a more expensive handheld that can actually natively run games. And then just general accessories for the PlayStation 5. People really enjoy the Pulse Wireless 3D headset. They've given us a Pro controller with the DualSense Edge. They have an upscale headset with their InZone branding where you can get the H7. I have no complaints at all about that headset. I use it on my PC and my PS5, and it's one of my favorite headsets of all time. Sony even has monitors that match up with the PS5 now with that InZone line. I have the M9 sitting right here, and this, just like their headset, is one of the best monitors I've ever used. So from an accessory standpoint, I think yes, Sony has finally figured out how to make the PS5 their center focus and then build out from there instead of splitting themselves kind of thin, making Vita games, making PSVR games, making PS5 games. Now they're making PS5 games. You just need different hardware to play them with the PSVR 2. And I think that's really cool. So yeah, there is console war stuff going on all the time. I understand that's how people build clout, and more power to them. It's just when you see things laid out in a grid, it is kind of crazy to see how many more games it looked like were coming out on the PlayStation 4. But when you really dig into it and look at the history of both consoles, I think Sony, while they might not be doing a better job at releasing games at a timely manner with the PlayStation 5, I think they're doing a really dang good job just on their own with all of the context of everything going on around them. So yeah, at the end of the day, I think the PS5 is a great console and definitely a massive upgrade over the PS4. Huge shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. If you've ever wanted to create your own website but you didn't know where to start, that's where Squarespace comes in. With their Fluid Engine system, they not only make it easy to create your own website, but once you do, they make sure it'll work across your desktop, your mobile phone, or really any device you access that website on. And if you've ever wanted to create an online store, it's also super easy with Squarespace. Whether you sell digital, physical, or service products, Squarespace has all of the tools you need to get started. And once you have that store set up, you can accept payment from multiple different sources because of their flexible payment system. So you can use PayPal, credit cards, Apple Pay, you can even use Afterpay. If that sounds cool to you, and I'm sure it does, head to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch your website, go to squarespace.com/PSReady for 10% off your first purchase of a domain or website. Again, huge shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring this video.